Hello, friends. It is between two Sundays where we sit and natter about biblical things across the internet because, well, modern technology, why wouldn't you? Mark Beresford, how are you this evening, my friend?
I'm very well, Mark Gladman. Another fine intro.
You got to do something with it, eh? Uh, last week we chewed on readings from the 15th Sunday after Pentecost. We had Exodus 12, we had Psalm 149, we had Romans 13 and Matthew 18. What has stuck with you out of the readings as you've walked out of last Sunday?
Yeah, just struck from Romans how central love is for Paul,
Mm,
um, which is interesting. I think we often argue that love is central for Jesus, but gee, Paul really is pulling it into the very center of his understanding of
yeah,
the gospel here. This is the behavior that must dominate every other behavior in his mind. And of course, we're here in Romans 13. So you just think that what looks like a more systematic letter than Paul writes in other places, systematic approach to the gospel. And I'm not arguing that it is entirely systematic. I don't think that's quite fair. I think there's something very pastoral and interacting with the people here. It's historical from the very moment it opens. So it's not, I don't want to argue that too strongly, but he really has gone out of his way to set out his understanding of the gospel. And here he is towards the end of that, beginning to articulate what he expects, how he understands that we should live out of this. And there is just no messing about with this in his mind. Love is the absolute outcome,
yeah,
and I think it's worth noting the consistency between Jesus being able to say loving God, loving your neighbor is so central, and Paul being able to echo the same thing here. And he really is saying, oh, this life, death, resurrection stuff that we've been talking about all through this gospel, this forgiveness, this radical forgiveness that is offered, this is where it's leading to. It's leading towards you being people who love generously and love in a costly way.
yeah,
You're following one who came and demonstrated the heart of God by doing precisely that. So the expectation is that this is the way that we're learning, and no other. I always find it relieving. I think sometimes I encounter people who seem to centralize Paul, and they really seem to centralize something other than love. But
yeah,
here, I think we can argue pretty clearly that Paul is another radical follower of Jesus, learning, as the church has right down through the centuries, growing, of course, but he's really starting from the right place, or his gospel is helping him arrive in the right place. So this
mm,
gospel that he articulates is helping him arrive here, and I think it's always worth noting just how central the call to love and generosity of spirit is to living out the gospel and living consistently with it.
right. I mean, a lot of people would point to Peter, they'd point to John, they'd point to James, but a lot of people say, "Oh, but Paul, there it is. Love is the
Yeah,
fulfillment of the
yeah,
law." I mean, you can't get any more
yeah,
central
yeah.
than that. I was really stunned still with uh you've got this here's Israel in slavery still. I mean, let's be honest, that they don't know. Well, they've been told what's going to happen, but it hasn't happened. So here they
Mm.
are having a feast um, in this condition of slavery. They're having a feast with nothing more than a promise of what's going to happen. Um, they're having a feast when there's a lot of uncertainty about what tomorrow is going to bring. Having a feast knowing that if things don't work out the way that they hope they're going to work out, it's probably going to get worse for them. But they're still having a feast. And coupled with the psalm, which is one of the great worship psalms that sort of fill the end 5 or 6 psalms in this collection of psalms that we have in Scripture. What you have here is this reminder that even when you don't know, feast, celebrate, praise, pray. Find a way that you can do that. And if there was ever a truer word to be said into my life right this second, this is probably it. And let's just leave it at that. and go with that right there.
Well, it's always a relevant call, isn't it?
Always. Yeah. All right, we are moving on to the 16th Sunday after Pentecost, which is coming up this week. The readings for this week: Exodus 14, verses 19 to 31, Psalm 114. We have Romans 14, 1 to 12, and Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. You'll find all those down below if you're watching on YouTube or in the show notes. If you are listening on your podcast host of choice, and of course, go to lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu, and you'll find the whole lectionary there, along with all the wonderful resources that we highly recommend week after week after week. If you're stuck, go have a look and then listen to Between Two Sundays. You might not need to listen if you go there first. Save yourself the pain. Let's
good advertising, Mark. Well done.
Let's stay there for the wrong people. Let's stay with Exodus. Let's stay in Exodus to start with. What has stuck out with you, for you, rather, here, Mark?
So I was trying to imagine what it's like with the angel of God going in front of you, leading you out of Egypt, and then the angel of God moving behind you. And it just seems to me that there's this, that it looks like this beautiful parable of God being in the right place at the right time. So you have, we have this angel of God leading them out, and they desperately need to be led out. They don't know where they're going, really. And here God is in front of them, and then they're being hounded from behind, and this angel of Yahweh moves to the back, in between. Perhaps we could say God is in the right place at the right time, that we have a responsive God when it comes to our leading. And maybe that doesn't always look like God being out front telling us where to go next. Maybe there are other ways that God actually leads and protects and guides his people. I was struck by the Israelites using the language of Yahweh. Yahweh is, what's it say? Let us flee from the Israelites, for Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt. So it's the Egyptians using this language of the God Yahweh, not just the Israelites. Clearly, there's an understanding of the Israelite God by the Egyptian people, and that's perhaps quite common in the sense that it can be used by representative language of all these people in this army. So it's not just the elite educated ones, but it seems that an understanding of Yahweh has seeped into the Egyptian mindset, which perhaps isn't very surprising given all the extraordinary scenes that Moses has been part of leading up to this point at which they've left. And there's another little bit of this story that kind of stood out to me, and that is the Israelites walking on dry ground through the parted sea. I don't know. There's there's something of a patience and a pacedness about walking through a scenario like that. Surely the temptation is to rush from one side to the other as quickly as possible. Let's make it at least a quick march, even if not a run. Yet the language is that they've walked. We certainly get the impression the Egyptians are moving much, much faster than Israel, who have all their wives and children and cattle with them and everything to weigh them down, and the enemy is chasing them with chariots, and yet here they find themselves in the middle of a miracle walking. I got to say that there are times I run through the bush, so I do trail runs in and around Canberra and love it, of course. There are other times I hike, and I always take in more when I slow down.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder if there's something about being in the middle of a miracle here and going slow enough to notice what's going on. And they've got every reason to go fast. They really do have every reason to rush this experience. But instead, the language is that they walked.
Can I play devil's advocate with you for a sec?
Sure.
You said a moment ago that God was in the right place at the right time, but not for the Egyptians. How do we carry that? And I guess this is a question that comes up a lot as you go through the narrative of Israel with, God was on our side, so we smashed the Vegemites up, or whichever rights they're on that day.
Yes.
How do you reach that?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, because, of course, Christianity has taken off in Egypt. The Egyptian Orthodox Church is very profound and very faithful, and
probably one of the oldest strains of the Orthodoxy. Yeah.
And so whatever answer we give to that, I think there's something about this story has not prevented people whose ancestors would have been part of this story and on the outer edge of this story, perhaps, from actually seeing the gospel and living it out together in community there. So, sometimes I wonder. I wonder if that's the kind of question that we ask, because we're philosophical Western people who kind of have it all together, and so we've been trained to be concerned for the people left out. And I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing, but by those people who are on the margins of a story like this, I'm not persuaded that they do feel left out by it. As strange as that might sound, they don't seem to be hung up on the same questions of God should be doing the same things in each and every circumstances as we probably have a tendency to. The same thing will happen, as we go into third world countries where, we with plenty will kind of throw up our hands. Why are there so many suffering? And yet the story of one miracle or one healing spreads like wildfire through those places. And they're not prone to ask that question, why not all of us? But actually they're prone to ask the question, this has happened among us. And so actually find it to be something that increases faith rather than decreases faith. Hmm.
Hmm.
How do you answer that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because literally what you
How do
have is
you, how do you, yeah,
you've got God saying, "I'll take these people, but I'm going to smash up the chariots and drown all the people of this people." Um,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
guess the
yeah.
and the reason why I ask is as I reflect on this passage, the thing that I notice is that um, whilst God doesn't need Moses' participation, Moses is asked to participate.
Hmm.
That there is this
Yeah,
ongoing participation of humanity and the divine together. The divine seeks participation from the human. You know, stretch out your hands, and the sea will part,
yes,
and the people will
yes,
cross over on dry land, and they'll be liberated.
yeah.
But if you keep reading
I
the
think
story,
this, yeah, yeah.
keep going, and it's now turn around and stretch out your hands, and the sea's
Hmm.
going to close in. So there is also the participation on that end
Yeah.
of the thing as well, and it's a tricky one.
Hmm.
And we could, I mean, there would be some people who would say, um, and there is some evidence that suggests that this story um, did not happen. That it's probably more myth than history. Myth meaning not that it's false, but that it's probably there are elements of it that would be true and elements of it that would not be true. And the people who would read this story and tell this story and share this story have absolutely no problem with that. I know that
Hmm.
to a lot of Western mindsets, and in particular Western Christians, that idea is a big struggle. Um, it's the way, I love the Icelandic sagas, but the Icelandic sagas are full of stories of
Yeah.
things that happened, but also things that probably didn't happen in the same story, of people that existed and people that didn't exist, going to places that are real and places that aren't real. But the Icelandic people go, that's not what the story's for. So if we think about what the
Hmm.
story's for, it sort of lets that go. But there's still that element of, you've got this human participation in this divine sea
Hmm.
closing over, or river, closing over of these people. Um, but for me, yeah, the thing that stands out is that the divine wants human beings to participate, and that there is a
Hmm.
sense of connectedness and working through. Um, and so if you hold that part of the story up, um, there is this sense of God wants to work in the lives through the lives of people, and to maintain that connection that we've talked about weeks ago when we were sharing around Genesis 1, 2, and 3, in particular Genesis 3, when God places 2 and 3, the end of 2 and 3, where God places these people in the garden and says, now work with me in it, look after
Hmm.
it, tend to it, um, which might raise a whole lot of other questions, but there is this general participation. And it's interesting to be reminded of that, um, and to see that for some reason God chooses to work through us and each other. And so when we
Hmm.
ask questions like, well, where is the love? You were talking about you going into third world
Yeah.
countries. Why is this happening here? Well, if God chooses to work through us, if the divine is choosing to work through human hands, then the question isn't, well, what's God doing here, but what are we doing here?
Hmm.
Which I think is
Hmm.
healthy in many ways.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so um,
This
despite
is
problem questions, it sort of encourages that along. Yeah, sorry, mate.
yeah. No, it's a really interesting question, because I agree with you. We certainly get very hung up on whether this happened, and we send submarines to the bottom of the Dead Sea to see what's there, and we in a Western mindset, um, we are very, very hung up on what happened. But to me, this is quite interesting around Psalm 114,
Mm,
because what we're looking at here is a response by people who weren't there.
right.
So by the time this psalm comes about in this final form, I think you have to say these are people hearing the stories who weren't there. And the response is that these stories have called them to faith. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. And of course, there's that just before that, why is it, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? Here's this very, very tight telling of really the story of Exodus. And everything that goes on in the life of Moses. So it's wonderfully appropriate to be read by the community after Exodus 14, I think. But here is a people who I can't see how, I don't think they were there. And yet this account has called them to a deeper faith. And I wonder if that's the real question. Somehow these people aren't hung up on, hang on, this is just a story handed down to me. Can I trust the people who've done this? What is the difference between what actually happened and the telling of this story? They're just not hung up on that. What they're allowing the story to do is invite them into this enchanted world where God intervenes and God is part of the world around them. I can't help but read this Psalm 114 and think, yeah, so here's a people in the middle of, firstly, the life of Moses and the life of Christ is yet to come. And here they are celebrating this God who seems to intervene in the way the world works at the moment for them. I don't know that that's automatically saying God doesn't do this in other places of the world, but this is kind of the perspective they have. You can understand how important it is, how humbling it is, how baffling it is for the disciples when Jesus turns around and calms the sea. This is the kind of thing that, everything their stories tell them is that this is the kind of thing God does. Yeah. And the response there, of course, is who is this one? This is the kind of story that we've only heard of from the people of old.
Yeah.
And so I don't mind this. I really understand how Psalm 114 has kind of been placed here as a bit of a response to this story.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, I mean, let's note too that the option of using the alternate of using Psalm 114 is to use the song in Exodus 15, which is the song that they sing when they get to the other side, which is that, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider is thrown into the sea. Here they are basically celebrating this thing that we're lamenting. But again, let's remember that it's unlikely that this was written down by the people who were there. So,
well, the claim is that it's written by Deborah, isn't it? Or sung
Miriam,
by Deborah.
The song sung by Miriam.
Sorry,
Moses'
Miriam.
sister,
You're right. Yeah. The claim. I understand what you're saying. I'm not trying to argue with it necessarily, but the story has placed it.
Places in her lips,
placed it in the lips of one who is supposed to have been there. Yeah, the other interesting thing, and I don't know if I'm drawing a long bow here, and that's Psalm 114. So yes, the Exodus 15 one, this is very Israelite-centric, if I can use that in hopefully an unoffensive way. Psalm 114, the response to all these miracles of God at work in Israel's history is tremble, O earth. That seems a lot bigger than just tremble, O Israel. And it's maybe it's a little difficult to know whether this is speaking to the ground, to the planet, or whether this is speaking to all people. Certainly, most of the psalm here is talking about how the earth, the elements have responded to God. But maybe as the people tell this psalm, sing this psalm, say this psalm, this is actually a call to all the earth, to all the people. Here is the God who has acted this way for Israel, and it's a call for everyone on earth to recognize this one.
Yeah, no, it's good. Right, Romans 14. It's interesting. I work with death. You might want to say. I at the moment, my ministry is being exercised in an aged care facility. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had 6 people die in 6 days. 7 at most. Depends on where you count where someone dies, but 6 people in a week. 5 of those were in one wing, and it wasn't related. They were all completely separate, completely for their own reasons. It just happens to be their time. Just before that happened, we had 2 other people pass away. At the moment, there's one person who's in end of life care with us right now. So I walk around death all the time. So it's probably no surprise that in this passage, the verse that really struck out as I reflected on it was, if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And the reason why that stuck, I think, is because one of the things that I've learned and continue to learn, I'll back up for a second. I think the best way to put this is, while I'd probably safely say before I was working in this role that I wasn't really afraid of death, I can tell you right now that I'm not afraid of death. I don't want to die, but if I were told tomorrow that, you are terminal, would it be sad? Absolutely. Would I mourn and grieve? You better believe it. Would I go and do some things that I wanted to do and be with some people I wanted to be with before I die? Yes, absolutely. But I could honestly say that I would be 100%, for want of a better term, okay with what's about to happen, and not afraid of it in that sense. And the reason why is because of the truth that sits behind Romans 14:8. Because I sit in the hands of the living God. I am in Christ. I've been redeemed by Christ. We have all been redeemed in Christ, in this Christ of the universe, this universal Christ, this God who is in all and through all and among all. And if anything, then what death opens up is embracing a new sense of being within that being, for want of a better term. And so I'm really struck by this, because it's a reminder to us that our basic source condition, our basic source position, station, whatever you want to call it, really doesn't change. Whether we live or whether we die, we're the Lord's. And that really should be an encouragement to us. It really should buoy us. And I would probably hedge your bet that if we could press Paul more, and I think perhaps what he's saying here, if you take the whole passage that we've got here in its fullness, is that whether we live, we are the Lord's, and whether we die, we are the Lord's. Whether we're rich, we are the Lord's. If we're poor, we are the Lord's. If things are going great, we are the Lord's. If things are crap, we are the Lord's. Insert your condition here, and at the end of the day, we're the Lord's. And so you've got to ask, you can't sort of come to a place of absolutely true contentment. And Paul talked about contentment a lot in his letters. And in this one verse, I get a true sense of why Paul can be that content. Because at the end of the day, he's the Lord's and he knows it. And that's got to be an encouraging thing. That's got to buoy us. That's got to make us go, really, the outcome here, I know I have a particular thing I would like to see happen. And I have a particular way perhaps I might like to see it happen. But at the end of the day, I'm still the Lord's and the Lord is still mine. And if you can find that contentment, I don't know, it just changes everything. And I don't know how to describe that because I think you have to find your own way there. Now, it's true, whether you can grasp it or not, it's true. So in that sense, it's going to be okay, folks. It's pretty much what I want to say. But if we can start to grapple with this and find that place, I think not only does it help us die better, but it helps us live better. And just running off the cuff now, but before you were saying how, that story from Exodus is a reminder to the people who are reading and hearing this story of how to respond. How will we now live? This is what happened. This was the dramatic rescue. Now what do we do? How do we live out of this? And what does that look like? This should do the same. And maybe this is just running off, but maybe this is one of the unwritten sort of lingering themes that we find in the readings this week. That it's a question of, this understanding and grappling with these things will actually help you live better. It will help you live to the full. Remembering that living to the full, and I've said this a bit, but living to the full means embracing everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. That's full living. And understanding that all those things and all those emotions and all those feelings and everything that goes with them are a part of what it means to be human. And if we experience life to the full, then we'll go through the gamut of those. But yeah, this verse really sticks because I think within it we find contentment, we find inspiration for how to use our lives now, and we find peace with the prospect that all of us face, apart from taxes was the other one, of the inevitable fact that we are all going to die. And this is a verse that I think if we can truly come to terms with it, can help us do that well as well.
I focused in my mind a little bit more on the verses at the beginning of this passage. And I wonder if it's for the same reason, for the sense of contentment, or the sense of peace. Paul for me is quite remarkable in this passage. You've got to remember, at one stage, Paul is, the Pharisee of Pharisees, he can describe himself as. So he's very legalistic. He's sorted out all the right and wrongs of the law and knows all the details, not just the sort of the Torah, but all the plethora of laws that have developed around it to make sure everyone keeps them all. And yet here he is, so changed by the gospel, I want to say, that, whether you're a vegetarian or whether you eat meat, I don't care. That's not the big deal. and he's interesting here because I think it's quite clear that Paul is prepared to eat meat, but he has what he describes as the weak only eat vegetables. And I wonder if this is the theologically weak. And rather than arguing against them, he's actually saying you're accountable to God, and I'm going to love you anyway. And the same for the Sabbath here. Paul just doesn't see this as a big deal.
That's right.
He wants us to be certain where we stand for today. But as far as he's concerned, you're another's. His language here is you're another's servant.
Yeah.
And this is one of the moments where it amazes me how consistent Paul is with his willingness to say we're under grace, not law. And this is what it looks like. It looks like us not being judgmental people. It looks like us not getting hung up on whether we do some religious act or another. It just looks like, I think, we're learning to love everyone.
Yeah.
So you can see how this comes so hot on the heels of our passage last week. And it's so deeply practical, as Paul takes the gospel beyond Israel. He clearly must encounter places where Sabbath is not practiced. And he must encounter places where there are reasons that people eat vegetables rather than meat. And for him, the gospel, the love of the gospel, the love the gospel calls us to, has become so central that these things have become peripheral. And yet, in his upbringing, in all his training, in all the way he has imagined his career, his religious career unfolding, these things are everything.
Yeah.
They are everything about being consistent with God and pleasing God. And he's got to the point where he's just saying, actually, they're nothing. They're not. Even if Paul has a conviction about these things, even him having that conviction is not going to be something he defends here. What he's going to defend is that you and I are accountable to God, and what God asks of us, we are expected to embrace. And if God asks, if you have a different understanding of God to me, this is actually okay. I'm not going to play judge. For someone brought up in the world Paul is brought up in, it's
radical,
extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Here he is saying, I think this is kind of a moment where he's trying to prove how central love has become. It's more central than the Sabbath. It's more central than all the eating laws that are pulling us apart, Jew and Gentile, and making us have to sit in different places and all this. Actually, Paul's coming to a point where he's just saying, I'm not willing to judge.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to be part of this. I'm just willing to love because I think that is core. For him to live this way, and I love this passage. I know it's a bit of a quirky passage for some, a bit fringe and a bit sort of, this is first century thinking that we don't embrace anymore. I tell you what, if we could see how radical this kind of love is, how edgy it is in the context of religious purity laws, and you know, all those Sabbath laws. If we could see how radical this is, I think we would live extraordinarily edgy, loving lives. If we were to embrace the perspective Paul has here, which is what he is arguing for. He is not arguing about eating meat or not eating meat. He is not arguing about Sabbath, good or bad. He is arguing that we are all different, and we are all at different stages in our walk with God, and we must not judge one another.
Yeah,
we must look at one another and love one another. That is the great argument being made here in this first part of this passage. For me, this is one of those passages that that opens up the extent of what love, the bigness of what love looks like. And it should surprise us every single time. But unfortunately, it's so easy just to read over the top of this really quickly. Oh yeah, here's a bit of Paul going on about food laws. Actually, he's not. He's going on about that core problem we have in the church, that we judge one another. That core problem in the church that we think, especially if people are leaders in the church, you know, you're supposed to follow me, not God. And this core, that love needs to rise to the surface. It needs to be above all of these things. I love it. I find this passage mind-blowing, to think that Paul lived out the love of Christ this radically.
Yeah. It's pretty powerful stuff. And that same radical love is what comes up in the gospel. And again, this is probably one of the most misused gospel passages of all time. There's a few. And I think the key to understanding this passage is to remember that it starts with, you know, how many times must I forgive? And Jesus, you know, 7 times. Peter says, and Jesus says, no, not 7 times, but 77 times. Yeah. For all the discussion of 7's the perfect number and 7 sevens double the perfect number, whatever, it's a lot of times that we're called to forgive. And then Jesus launches straight into a parable, which starts with, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared. So a couple of things here. First of all, this is talking about what does it look like when we forgive that way on earth as it is in heaven. That's what we're talking about here. The second thing is, it's comparing the kingdom of heaven to a king. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king. It doesn't say that God is the king, it says the kingdom of heaven is the king. And if you want to understand this parable well, you've got to hold that. The king is not God. The king is the kingdom of heaven. The king represents how we go about doing and being in the world, right? So first of all, and I'll get to the last bit at the end, because I know some of you are saying, yes, but what about the last verse? Get there in a second. Right now, though, this king is the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven wants to settle all accounts with all the people that work for them. All right? So right there is the grace that you were talking about before. The fullness of grace. This king who can rightly say, you'll give me what I want and you'll, you know, I'm going to settle the account. Right? So it does, settles the account. But of course, there's one dude who then goes to the person who works for him and says, pay me what you owe me. What are you doing? Where's the debt you owe me? And has him thrown in jail. So what we've got here is a demonstration of, coming back to what we talked about, this pattern we're seeing in the readings. How do I respond to what I'm experiencing here? If the kingdom of heaven says we live in a mode that is merciful and gracious and loving and forgiving, how can we then turn around and live in a way that's contrary to that? How should I live out of this extension of grace and mercy to me? Well, the reality is that the kingdom of heaven is the king. So therefore I should act like the king because the king acts through me. The kingdom of heaven comes through me. And what's interesting about that is that person who doesn't forgive the person who owes them gets found out. And it says there, the king summons him back and says, "You wicked slave, I forgave your debt, and you haven't shown the same mercy to a fellow slave as I had mercy on you." And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he could pay his entire debt. There'll be some people out there going, see, God wants to condemn and torture and punish those who don't do that. Well, here's my question. The king themselves don't actually do the torturing. The king themselves, it says, hands that person over to be tortured. And you might ask, well, what torturing do they get? And my suggestion would be the torturing of the fact that they've created for themselves a complete mess where they've been forgiven, but they have failed to extend that same forgiveness, and they've had that pointed out to them, and that will sit and chew them over until they pay the entire debt. What is the debt? Well, in the kingdom of God, the debt is to love. Love is the fulfillment of the law. And so the torture happens because we're not doing the thing we're created to do.
Yeah.
The torture doesn't come from God.
So
the king,
hell exists inside us rather
right, and we create
as an external as an experience rather than this external afterlife thing. It becomes something that's
right. This is not a story of afterlife. Not even that, because it says the person's only going to be tortured until the debt's been repaid. And so as soon as he learns how to love again, the debt's been repaid. As soon as he learns how to extend mercy and love and forgiveness, of course that torture, tumultuousness, it's going to leave. It'll depart because they're walking in love. And then, so my Heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you don't forgive your brother and sister from your heart. And see, God's going to do it to us. That's right. God is going to turn you over to the deep down guilt, nagging, gnawing truth that you have created within yourself, that you have failed to extend mercy and love and gratitude to a brother or sister, for knowing full well that God has extended that same mercy, love and gratitude towards you. And until you do come to that place, you will continue to be tortured, not because God has done anything to you, but you're doing it to yourself.
There's this is all emphasized only more when we look at the numbers here. So 10,000 talents. They reckon that's 60 million working days. So this is not just a debt. I mean, this is an extraordinary, over the top debt, and it's all been forgiven. So we start this story with someone who's been forgiven on an unpayable level, and the temptation for this one is to turn to one who owes him really very, very little, certainly compared to what he's just walked away from, and just is not willing to hand it on. And I can't read this without thinking the numbers are really important here. Here is Jesus going out of his way to say, here is an unpayable debt.
Yeah.
You cannot get out of this kind of debt. There aren't 60 million days work in a lifetime to kind of put this together. So if the king goes and sells him and sells his family, we're not regaining this money. The other thing that always strikes me, and I wish I'd picked it up at the time, but I preached on this at a youth camp many, many years ago now. someone came up to me afterwards and said, what kind of irresponsible king allows someone to get in that much debt? And at the time, I didn't really think about that. And I thought that that's a really interesting take.
Kids say the damnedest things,
But,
don't they?
oh, they do. Absolutely. But
Yeah.
but I mean, hasn't that hit the nail on the head?
Yeah.
Why has God been so patient with you that you have a debt that you cannot pay? If you had, even if you had, you know, uh, even if you had multiple lifetimes, you could not get out of this debt. What kind of irresponsible patience allows someone to get into that debt and then forgives it? There's a multiplication here that's saying you're forgetting. You know, if you're willing only to forgive 7 times, and to be fair, Peter's suggestion here is pretty edgy. I don't think anyone was suggesting 7 times. That's a little bit irresponsible. This parable just goes way, way, way over the top of what Peter is suggesting here, and kind of dwarfs it. And you end up with this picture of not only extraordinary debt forgiven, but also of extraordinary patience that has allowed someone to get into this scenario. And the grace of God is just multiplied out here beyond our capacity to imagine. And I think this is one of the keys of this parable, that Jesus is essentially saying to Peter, oh, Peter, you've forgotten how much you've been forgiven.
Yeah.
And if you could grasp how much you've been forgiven with this crazy over-the-top parable that is being told here, if it can help you grasp how stuck you were and how forgiven you are, I think you'll become the type of person who forgives in the same way. And enjoys the freedom of that, which is exactly what you were getting at towards the end of the parable there. I really like what you were saying, because I think we think forgiveness is all about, if I don't forgive, this will do something to the person who did me wrong. I don't know what to say to that anymore. That just seems so ridiculously absurd when I meet people who are so bitter, angry, and entrenched in their unforgiveness. I think to myself every time, you're hurting yourself here. And I because of this parable, because of other moments in the Gospels of the call to forgiveness, I am becoming increasingly sensitive to the moment anger or a grudge rises up in me. Because I don't think this is, I don't think we go through the world without the wrong thing being done to us and without us becoming angry people. The only difference here is, will we let it go or will we hold on to it? And I come across more and more people, and I just, who are bitter and twisted because they will not forgive, because they're convinced they're hurting the other or they're paying back the other by not forgiving. I just think you've lost the plot. Most of the time, I think you have absolutely lost the plot, thinking that this is doing damage to others rather than doing damage to you. This message here, this message of this parable, this call to radical forgiveness, is a call to embrace radical freedom from holding the grudge. And it's costly, but make no mistake, Jesus is going out of his way to say there is something more costly than letting go, and that is holding on.
Absolutely. There you go. How are you going to live out of these things? That's kind of been our theme as we've walked through the passages for the 16th Sunday after Pentecost. What did you think what's rattling through your head as you reflect on these passages? Drop us a line, let us know. Go down to barefootfollower.life and leave Mark a message on his website there on his blog, or pop over to Between Two Sundays, that's number 2 at gmail.com, and tell us what you think there. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on that as we move forward. The readings for the 16th Sunday after Pentecost were Exodus 14 verses 19 to 31, Psalm 114, Romans 14 verses 1 to 12, and then Matthew 18 verses 21 to 35. May God and the Spirit be with you as you chew and reflect on these passages as we approach this coming Sunday. There you go, man.
Great to chat.
What do you say?
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was good, man. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we hope you'll do so again next week for another edition of Between Two Sundays. And until then, it's bye from this side.
Bye.